This talk is one of a series of online talks as part of the Leaves of Southwell Project, funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. We're aiming to provide talks on wide-ranging topics, all connected in some way to the project. Today's talk is given by Cassandra Harrington. Cassandra Harrington is a medieval art historian and PhD candidate at the University of Kent. She has research interests in sculpture, manuscripts and illumination, architecture, the transmission and reception of ideas, and the dialogue between visual and textual modes in medieval Europe. Cassie currently teaches at Kent as an assistant lecturer at the School of History and is working on a reappraisal of Gothic foliate head iconography for her PhD. So I'd now like to pass you on to Cassie, and I do hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that lovely introduction. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. And hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see so many of you here. And I'm looking forward to sharing my latest research with you. So I'll just go ahead and try and share my screen. Hopefully a PowerPoint should appear. Let me know if it works. There we go. That should be showing now. Lovely. Hopefully that's showing for everybody. So yes, just before I dive straight in, I want to say that I'll be sharing a couple of my more enigmatic and hopefully interesting studies with you today, as it would just be impossible for me to get through everything in the 45 minutes or so that we've got. But my project will hopefully be published in due course so that you'll be able to read it in its entirety. Then if you'll be interested, of course. But if you do have any questions, then please do ask me after the talk, as I'd really welcome your thoughts. And I look forward to opening up a discussion with you all at the end. So let's begin. So anyone who is a fan of these enigmatic images will know that foliate heads and anthropomorphic leaf masks and these other plant hybrid figures have endured in Western art for thousands of years. Faces amalgamated with vegetal forms materialize in the art of 1st century Rome, but by the 12th century they had become ubiquitous. Foliate figures were distributed in abundance throughout the fabric of the cathedrals, churches and monasteries of Gothic Europe, and appearing across a wide range of material objects. They are often referred to as green men in Anglophone scholarship or English scholarship, and their significance has been examined through the lenses of ecology, cultural studies, and local history by folklorists and independent historians alike. However, and somewhat surprisingly, a little attention has been paid to them by art historians. So in the High Gothic period, which is what I work on, so that's circa 1200 to 1350, foliate heads and masks continued to enrich ecclesiastical buildings, and they developed stylistically and spatially over time until they had become firmly rooted in iconographical tradition. In comparison to their pictorial counterparts, seen in the margins of manuscripts, the sculptured survivals are ubiquitous. You really do find them everywhere. And so these Gothic foliate heads and masks are most commonly found in architectonic ornament, which you can see in the slide. That is, sculpture which has a structural function in the church fabric. You tend to find them on capitals, corbels, ceiling bosses and lintels, rather than as solely decorative sculpture. But they were also produced on monumental sculpture such as fountains and tombs. However, their main occurrence was an architectonic one, a structural one, manifesting in the living fabric of the buildings in which they inhabit. Much existing literature on the subject, in English at least, is focused on an objective visual analysis of these objects, sometimes in isolation of their immediate historical context, and applied in relation to present-day implications, and it can be somewhat Anglocentric in its scope. However, if there is one thing that researchers have agreed on, it is that these foliate faces were not intended merely as a decorative motif, devoid of meaning, but one that was profoundly semantically charged. In fact, images and the visual arts more generally have often been conceived as a language. Likewise, Gothic art had a typically linguistic quality, serving to communicate ideas and direct its viewers both physically and mentally, as well as academically, morally, and spiritually. Sculptors and artisans were aware of what they were communicating in the signs that they embedded within their images. Figures were given distinctive iconographical ciphers, which made them instantly recognizable. Think, Christ as the lamb and John the Evangelist as an eagle, and saints identifiable by the objects of their martyrdom, with distinctive physical characteristics, or clothing, as were certain narrative scenes. Foliate masks and heads are also identifiable by their unique combination of physical attributes, but they don't have a singular literary referent or other such signifier. This raises the question as to how one might read the intended language of foliate masks and other such marginal sculpture, particularly when they carry no immediately obvious ciphers to the modern-day viewer. It also questions as to whether foliate heads and masks were inherently understood by the general medieval populace, or if their readings required perhaps a specialist knowledge or a familiarity with esoteric materials. So consequently, my research has led me to take a close view of these images, examining them in relation to their social and historical context, including networks of cultural and intellectual exchange, location, the habitus of their creators, the presence and oftentimes absence of adjacent imagery, visibility and considerations of how they functioned in relation to ecclesiastical space. Drawing on archaeological sources, architectural record, and written texts alongside my fieldwork dataset, today I'm going to be talking about how recovering and piecing together the historical context of these sculptures can shed a little bit more light on their significance. So I'm going to be sharing now a couple of my case studies with you, each of which has been selected based on the ways that they comment on the historical developments of sculptural function, stylistic taste, and the changing intellectual interests of a rapidly changing Europe. I'm going to explore the ubiquity of these images and the role that literary imagination and knowledge both played in their expansion across Europe in the High Gothic period. So before we delve right in and take a closer look at some of these beautiful carvings, I'm just going to set the scene now. Hopefully this works, that's how you do it. I'm going to set the scene now by giving some brief context of the time period for those of us who might not be so familiar with it. So the 12th century had just witnessed a shift from Romanesque, or sometimes known as Norman art and architecture, to Gothic. This new style had spread out from the Ile-de-France surrounding Paris, where it had begun, to neighbouring countries, including what is now the UK, Germany, and the Low Countries. Foliate heads and masks also reflected these developments, moving away from the more bestial figures common in Romanesque art and taking on a new quasi-human significance and appearance. So Paris was a bustling, artistic and intellectual hub that was rapidly growing in population. It saw intense urban expansion, renowned royal power, the growth of its cathedral schools, and later the University of Paris. It was a very wealthy city inhabited by revolutionary thinkers. The Gothic movement saw sculptors move away from highly stylized imagery in favour of studying objects more as they appeared in life. Medieval masons also carved in a stylistic rediscovery of classical art during what has been coined the 12th century Renaissance. Now, as far as foliage is concerned, these developments can be seen in the more botanically accurate foliate sculpture produced, such as the leaf carvings in the chapter house at Southwell, in Lincoln, Naumburg and Reims, and in the transept portals at Chartres Cathedral, which you can see in the current slide. You only need to look closely at the crevices behind the main iconographical programme to see this plethora of vegetation twisting and turning in the shadows in a strong effort to face the sun. Chartres, as a school, had many successful scholars, including the area of Chartres, and it was also where John of Salisbury was made bishop in 1176. Now, keep this in mind as I'm going to be bringing up scholasticism again a bit later on. So, some quick context on the nomenclature and the classification of these images. As we've said earlier, Green Man is a relatively recent term coined by Lady Raglan in an article for the Folklore Journal in 1939. In this article, she suggested that medieval foliate figures of English churches were derived from Robin Hood and the Jack in the Green figures of May Day celebrations. Now, despite Roy Judge evidencing in the 1970s that the figure of Jack in the Green only dates back as far as the 18th century, this idea that foliate faces in churches across England, Wales and Scotland as subversive fertility symbols has dominated much ideology on the subject for the best part of a century. In Europe, there is a somewhat different take. French art historians don't use the term Green Man or the French equivalent, which would be l'homme vert. Instead, they are mostly referred to as tête de feuille, leafy heads, or masque feuilly, leaf mask. Some German literature has, however, adopted the term grüner Mann, although Blattmaske, or leaf mask, is also used. And I've also come across appropriation in Dutch publications as well, where male and female foliate figures are referred to as die groene man and die groene vrouw. So, in addition to, in English scholarship, these mistaken attributions of origin, the Green Man is somewhat of a misnomer, not only because many of these objects aren't green, and we have a wealth of evidence of polychromy, extant polychromy in paint samples taken from Romanesque and Gothic carvings, which show that the majority of them were actually painted either red or yellow and sometimes with gold as well. Very few were painted green. But more importantly, and this is more importantly, not all of them were men. Yes, we have many male figures, distinctively masculine with their beards and facial hair made from vegetation. But we also have examples of women and grotesques, animals, and cats in particular. In fact, there are a lot of feline-like foliate heads prevalent in the margins of ecclesiastical buildings just before the Gothic period, such as this rather fabulous example from the tympanum of Marcy Allier, which shows lovely tendrils sprawling out under the nose and around the ear, just above the Christ in Majesty scene below. So yes, we have these feline faces. They're not human, they're not men. And we have more almost demonic, bestial incarnations too, very, very visceral images, almost consuming, very different images and carved by very different people. And we also have many which aren't gendered at all. They're distinctly human, yes, but they're neither explicitly male or female, at least not in any way that's not made immediately obvious by the physiognomy. So the Green Man is a figure with no historical substance. It's a modern day invention, and as such is an incongruous term in the field of art history. And as such, for reasons of perhaps representational accuracy, a less demagogic semantic field, and most importantly, its correspondence with medieval nomenclature, I prefer to use the terms foliate mask and foliate heads. I feel that this subcategorization is a useful, if not integral, tool when it comes to the interpretation of these separate yet related images. This reasoning for classifying a foliate figure as head, mask, or composite lies in whether the vegetative element comes from within the form, emitted via the mouth, nose, etc., or from the surface, either as a mask or growing out from the skin and covering the form beneath in a layer of leaves. The more inclusive umbrella term of foliate figures is used in lieu of green men, with relevance to all plant hybrid figures. That's heads, masks, composites, all genders and all species. It's important to note that there are, of course, exceptions and limitations to all methods of taxonomy, and this system is no exception. Of course, there are going to be always occasional figures that break the mould and transcend classification, occasionally appearing as an amalgam of both head and mask, And they're really great when they do. They're really fun to spot. And there are also examples of full figures, not just heads, but heads attached to bodies. But these are quite rare. So yes, foliate heads and masks were undoubtedly carved in dialogue with one another. Both motif variants coexist in parallel contexts and often appear side by side, as on the corbels of the south transept at Chartres and in the roof bosses in the cloisters at Norwich Cathedral. In fact, if there is more than one foliate figure present in any area of a building, there's usually a diversity in their iconography. So, what name were they known by in the Middle Ages? Did they have a name? Well, yes and no. We have evidence of marginal notation dating from the 13th century in the portfolio of Picardian draftsman Viard d'Annecourt. Now, among the expansive diagrams and drawings in Viard's manuscript are 4 foliate figures up on the screen. Both display drawings and annotations that clarify an understanding of the foliate head in the sculpture, whilst shedding light on its popularity, certainly of enough significance for medieval draftsmen to study. Viard would likely not have drawn these images had he not found them of interest in some way. In fact, many of the portfolio's inscriptions are written by Viard himself, and so he was versed at least well enough in written French with a little Latin, and it is possible that he had access to a cathedral school education and had a knowledge of the liberal arts. Now, I don't have much time to talk about these objects today, as we're focusing on sculpture, but do ask me later if you're interested in them. So yes, back to nomenclature. So on the opposite folio of these 2 leaf masks, a written hand at the top of the opposite folio describes 2 of these figures as têtes de feuilles, and I'll highlight that for you so you can see it there. So that is têtes de feuilles, or heads of leaves, effectively foliate heads. So with that in mind, I'm now going to share some of my work on the fountain basin at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. And what is perhaps the earliest survival of the foliate mask in Gothic sculpture, and also, in my opinion, perhaps the most enigmatic. So this stone lavabo or fountain basin was carved at the turn of the 13th century, so around circa 1200, for the Abbey Cloister at Saint-Denis. We don't know much about the appearance of the medieval cloister, as it was pulled down and rebuilt in the 18th century. However, it was situated in much the same position as you can see here in this late 17th century engraving, so to the south of the Abbey Church, which I'll highlight for you here. So, looking back to the figure itself, this leafy figure from Saint-Denis is notably not architectonic in form, but monumental, and detached from the core fabric of the building. However, it is typical of later Gothic convention in that it was created for a typically monastic setting. So a little bit of context on the Basilica. The Basilica of Saint-Denis was founded on the site of a Gallo-Roman cemetery by the Merovingian king Dagobert and situated just north of Paris. It was established as a Benedictine monastery in the 12th century. And during this time, the abbey was substantially rebuilt under the patronage of its abbot, Abbot Suger, in the new and innovative Gothic style. And it's fitting then that this new Gothic style of architecture should be born at Saint-Denis in the 12th century, alongside the genesis of Gothic foliate head sculpture. So following these new building developments under Suger, the nave of the abbey was completed in the 13th century, as was this fountain for its cloisters. So the fountain itself was originally formed of 2 tiers, with the sizable upper basin measuring around 12 feet 6, and resting on 16 marble columns above a larger lower basin. This wash drawing up on the screen is by the Dutch antiquarian Arnold Van Buchel, and it's the only depiction I have been able to find, laboriously I tell you, to find something that shows the basin in its original form. The lower basin that you see here has since been lost, presumably destroyed during the Revolution. So Van Buchel carried out this wash drawing when he visited Saint-Denis at the end of the 16th century in 1585. Now, unusually, the outer surface of the basin is carved in low relief with 28 heads set in medallions or paterae surrounding the outside of the basin itself. And each is depicted in a combination of portrait and profile. Each of these heads represents a figure from antiquity, and it's an amalgam of animals, elements, allegories, heroes, mythological figures, and both Roman and Greek deities. And each of these figures proves readily identifiable, not through their iconography, which is perhaps not immediately obvious, but through the names inscribed above each of the medallions. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see, these are old photographs, but if you can just about see the names above the roundels of each figure. So the basin is a rarity of medieval monumental sculpture in that it depicts classical figures. And at first, the pictorial programme seems to be arbitrary, with no immediately discernible coherence. So allegories or contemporary or complementary characters are often grouped together in pairs facing towards one another, like Paris and Helen, or in larger groupings, such as Flora, Sylvanus, and Faunus. Flora and Faunus are shown turned laterally inwards to face Sylvanus, who is shown facing the front. And you can just about see this to the far right of the fountain basin here in the slide, with Sylvanus in the centre. So whilst I've discussed the wider iconographical programme in my thesis, the figure that is of course going to be of most interest for the purpose of my talk today is going to be that of Sylvanus. So fan-like, this crown of oak leaves grows out from his forehead, and he usually appears as a foliate mask. You can see the Latin Sylvan inscribed above the medallion with the residual US or us denoted by a ligature. Associated with and sometimes synonymous with similar pastoral deities of Pan in Greek and Faunus, the Roman gods, Sylvanus was also linked to the figure of Silenus in Greek tradition. But we know that there's not a case of conflation with Pan and Faunus at Saint-Denis, as both figures elsewhere appear individually, elsewhere on the fountain. In fact, curiously, Sylvanus was never depicted as a foliate mask in antiquity. And so this is a unique case of medieval iconographical reinvention. Indeed, the mason seems to have reappropriated the form of sculpted leaf masks, considering them perhaps a suitable guise for this figure, to create perhaps a new allegorical programme for the monks to contemplate on as they cleanse their hands. And the mason does this a lot on the fountain. He even depicts Neptune with a fish on his head, and I wish I had a photo to show you now, but it's something I'd never seen before, really quite strange. So the date of the medieval cloister where the fountain was situated has been the subject of much debate and continues to be quite problematic. But nevertheless, in the early 13th century, the cloister underwent extensive remodelling, and it's likely from the beginning of this building phase that the fountain originates. Its two-tier structure, with the inclusion of holes drilled between the medallions to allow for the flow of water into the basin below, certainly signifies its use as a lavabo. The circular form, rather than hexagonal, indicates a position at the centre of the cloister, rather than at the edge. And it is here that the monks would perform their ablutions before entering the main church. Little was known about the appearance of the medieval cloister at Saint-Denis until relatively recently. The sculptural programme of the surrounding masonry remained largely hypothetical until excavation work in 1990 uncovered 160 stone fragments from the cloister arcade. Indeed, the archaeological evidence shows that the Gothic cloister at Saint-Denis was filled with foliate sculpture. The cloister also contained column sculptures of Old Testament figures and kings, including an apparent King Dagobert, which are among the earliest survivals for cloister column figures. So it's probable that Abbot Hugh, who was the abbot at the time of the fountain's creation, had the wider design scheme of the cloister in mind when he commissioned the lavabo carvings, and it was finalised likely some 50 years after the completion of the cloister. Now, if this were the case, it would demonstrate the wish to connect the fountain decoration with the rest of the cloister, to form a cohesive visual programme and with a specific pre-existing spatial context in mind. So what purpose, then, would the basin's entirely unique decorative scheme have in such a setting? Did it have explicit symbolic associations that would have been familiar to the monks? What can this tell us about the developments of earlier Gothic foliate mask iconography? And are the basin carvings a deliberate attempt at recreating the classical style? And with this last question, at least, it certainly appears so. Around 20 years after his death, in around 1170, there was a resurgence of interest in Abbot Suger's work at Saint-Denis. Copies of his writings were made, and it is apparent that he was, in fact, a great admirer and advocate of classical imitation work. So in order to attempt the other inquiries, however, we must momentarily look beyond the Saint-Denis cloister and its turn of the century lavabo. Now, in his seminal work on Gothic sculpture, Sauerlander somewhat laconically observed that the fountain basin at Saint-Denis carried a resemblance to antique models. And in fact, such is the likeness of the basin to antique art that in the 16th century, various antiquarians visiting the abbey believed the fountain basin to be Roman in its origin. So the stylistic rendering and manner in which the figures on the Saint-Denis basin are carved, with the Latin inscriptions above each of the paterae or medallions, are in fact redolent of Roman carvings found elsewhere in France. And motifs of heads in paterae were also familiar, carved on the triumphal arches in northern France, such as the Porte de Mars in Rennes, which is on the screen in front of you. I'll just highlight where these medallions are. Saints. So yes, erected in the 3rd century AD by the Gallo-Romans, the Porte de Mars has 8 heads carved in roundels, 4 on each side, between the 3 round archways and each flanked by 2 fluted pillars. Large antique monuments such as these were well known to the medieval public, visible, and above all, influential. So with an abundance of Gallo-Roman sculpture prevalent in the environs of the Ile-de-France, in addition to Abbot Suger's advocacy of classical imitation, as well as its rendering and iconography, it would not be imprudent to suggest that the basin at Saint-Denis was carved with such antique sculpture as a model. In fact, it was common for medieval artisans to appropriate certain formulae from antiquity, reimagining it for an ecclesiastical context and imbuing it with a new allegorical significance. In fact, survivals of Gallo-Roman foliate heads and masks abound, such as this 2nd century AD frieze fragment carved with a singular leaf mask and found near Périgueux in the south of France, near Bordeaux. Now, does it remind you of anything? Well, let's see. So, iconographically, both Viard's drawing and this Gallo-Roman carving bear several similarities, from the downward growth of foliage undulating in layers, and the points at which this joins the face, and to the new stem of growth protruding from the top of the head and the effective upwards gaze. These observations, and this is my opinion, so I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts later, seem to indicate that the first of Viard's images were drawn from life, from perhaps classical architectural spolia. So might this formula have been inspired from such contemporaneous sculpture? What then of these figures and their significance? So let's look back at the foliate mask at Saint-Denis. So the basin at Saint-Denis is testament to the success of 12th century edifying literature. Not only was Roman sculpture of interest to the medieval patron and artisan, but also the textual culture. Medieval clerks delighted in the poetry of antiquity, and Gothic institutions such as monasteries, schools, and colleges retained a plethora of texts in their repositories and libraries. These books would have been used to teach Latin grammar, syntax, and rhetoric, but they were also the basis for new allegorical commentaries and philosophical models, such as those of Plato, which proved useful tools in thinking about the issues of theology. So Gothic developments in sculpted vegetation coincided with an increased focus on humanity's relationship with the natural world. The coalescence of plant and human form may have been abundant in medieval visual culture, but it was also a prominent rhetorical device in textual culture, as nature was personified in scholastic works, such as Alain Delille's De Planctu Naturae, or The Complaint of Nature, which is a satire on the vices of humanity. So indeed, then by the end of the 12th century, representations of nature had infiltrated the literary and intellectual imagination, as well as the aesthetics of art and architecture. Medieval literary cases of transformation are perhaps most common in the poetry of Ovid. The Metamorphoses, written in 1st century Rome, contains a wealth of vivid imagery of men and women transforming into animals, rocks, other humans, gods, goddesses, and of course, plants. It's widely accepted that the Metamorphoses was disseminated to the edges of Europe via the same routes as Cenobitic monasticism, along with the rest of the Ovidian literary canon, including the Fasti and other works. So the poem was to become one of the most popular classical texts in medieval Europe, used for its benefit to the learning of grammar and rhetoric in the cathedral schools, but also the focus of a series of allegorical and moralized interpretations, such as that in the current slide, written by Arnold Van Buchel in the mid-13th century. So, indeed, towards the end of the 12th century, Ovid's works were being studied in Orleans, and a series of commentaries on individual poems were produced by its schoolmasters Arnulf, William, and Fulco, where its themes were absorbed by the cultural consciousness throughout its study and subsequent allegorizations. Here, Ovid's stories of Apollo and Daphne, along with Baucis and Philemon transforming into trees, are among the most well-known. This is a 13th century copy of Arnold's text, as I've just said, and the class mark is Burney MS224, and it's held at the British Library. So, metamorphosis was a recurrent theme in medieval French literary culture, exploring understandings of embodiment, the superiority of the human mind, and through which medieval Europeans experienced classical myth. Foliate masks reflect the spaces in which we find them. On the continent, they are especially common in centres of learning, at the heart of the monastic and scholastic environment, and this also becomes apparent later in Britain at York, in Southwell, Lincoln, Salisbury, etc., where they are found in cloisters, corridors, doorways, and ceiling bosses, tympana, lintels, etc. Now, among the most striking of these image types is a keystone boss recovered from the former site of the 13th century Collège de Cluny in Paris. So, during the Haussmannian works of the 19th century, the medieval buildings of the college were demolished. In what is now the 5th arrondissement near the Sorbonne, this late 13th century constituent college of the former University of Paris facilitated a scholastic education for its monastic community. Beyond some early 19th century photographs, sketches, and a floor plan, little is known about the appearance of the college. So the college buildings may be lost. However, several architectonic sculptures were saved from the complex during demolition, comprising 11 keystones, 2 capitals, and 3 corbels. These now form part of the collection at the Musée de Cluny, also known as the Musée National du Moyen Âge. And among these surviving sculptures is this foliate mask, adorned with, quite unusually for a foliate mask actually, with parsley leaves. The keystone is a beautiful specimen, though it's not an isolated case of foliate sculpture from the college, which also contained a plethora of other botanically inspired keystones. However, it is unique in being the only figured example from the site. So, carved from limestone, this foliate mask would have occupied the vaulting of the college chapter house. With almond-shaped eyes that are deep set and open, the face candidly gazes outwards, directly at the viewer. 6 oversized parsley leaves emanate over the brow, from the bridge of the nose, and above and below the mouth. The 2 topmost leaves cascade up and over the forehead like a fan, and the nose is strong yet naturalistic, and the mouth is hidden, pursed around an iron ring, and the integral ends of 3 half ribs remain, projecting out from behind the foliage. So as fits the pattern of 13th century foliage representation, there is no matter paid to maintaining a uniform scale here, and they are not strictly mimetic, yet the characteristic botanical expression of the leaves is retained. This is something that's not uncommon of Gothic sculpture. As many of you might know, Nicholas Pevsner noted that the 13th century stonemason had a very quick eye to observe the characteristic features of certain leaves, but no scientific ambition. And he says this with reference to the leaf carvings at Southwell's Chapter House, which are also oversized, even though they are botanically accurate. So this stone would have been surrounded by an array of other bosses, each carved with a unique foliate design depicting a variety of species, including maple, ivy, and grapevines. So founded in 1269 by Yves de Vergy, who was abbot of Cluny, the college complex was built to serve the community in Paris. After de Vergy's death, work on the college continued under the hands of his son, Chassant-Yves, who oversaw the construction of the remaining buildings, including the church and chapter house. Now, it was in the year 1859 that proved fatal for the college's vaulted church, chapter house, and refectory. So surviving architectural plans such as this proved to be a useful tool when it comes to reconceptualizing where these surviving keystones would have occupied the space in situ. So according to this plan by Adolphe Berthier, the college was a substantial building complex with 3 large vaulted rooms. There was a 7-bayed church, chapter house, and refectory. So the chapter house, now shown in red, could be accessed diagonally from the cloister, shown in green, from the church, in blue, and the refectory, in yellow. And it could also be accessed from the main street. So you had all of these different avenues leading directly to the chapter house. So the church and refectory had 6 and 8 cross vaults respectively, with the chapter house adjoining the west end of the church, having 4 bays, a central pillar, and 3 spans with distinctive cross vaults. Now, the differential junction at the tip of the ribs proves valuable in terms of clues for identifying the provenance of the sculpture fragments that we have at our disposal. So it's therefore possible to attribute to the chapter house the following keystones, due to the distinctive shape of their remaining rib terminations. So one Y-shaped and another 2 asymmetric yet bilateral. I'll see if I've got pictures. There we go. So you can see the foliate head is on a Y-shaped rib, and the 2 foliage keystones are on these asymmetric, almost cross-shaped vaults. So if I go back, I've highlighted where this foliate mask would have been in situ in the chapter house, highlighted in red on the plan. And there is no other such space within the chapter house that it could have occupied. So you can get a sense of height from this engraving of the chapter house from 1860, just before its demolition. And it's useful to imagine this keystone as it would have been observed in the 13th century, centrally situated at the apogee of the vault between the doorway and the central column, or walking through the west door of the church into the chapter house and glancing up, one would come directly eye to eye with the mask, peering straight down with its gaze. And it would have been coated with a host of vibrant polychromy, worlds away from the blanched limestone beneath that we see today. And in fact, we have extant traces of red polychromy still seen on some of the other foliate bosses from the complex. So parsley is an atypical choice when it comes to the choice of figuration for a foliate head. It's not the common classical acanthus or the oak or hawthorn or the woodland, nor the grapes central to the world of viticulture that were the most common choices for these objects. However, the Cluniacs were renowned for their love of gardening and utilising green open spaces for horticultural purpose. In fact, the Collège de Cluny had the enclosed garden with its diagonal corridor leading to the chapter house, which you can just see going off diagonally off of the plan to the right-hand side. Parsley was a popular cultivated herb that was at the centre of medieval domestic life, and one that was used in both culinary and medicinal practice. A familiar addition to the monastic garden, parsley was, by association, a plant very much domesticated by man. This image hardly depicts a human-plant hybrid with its human element subordinate to the wild. Instead, humanity governs over the image with which it exists in symbiosis. instead remaining somewhat parasitic on its vegetative host. Now, adorning the margins of monasteries and churches, it was ornamentation such as this that Bernard of Clairvaux had rallied against in his Apologia, aghast at the half-men that he said festooned the cloisters. However, the margins, and indeed the centre of devotional space, continued to be adorned with much such decoration of similar hybrids and beasts over the coming years. Now, bestiaries have often been a key interpretative tool for the numerous weird and wonderful medieval creatures. However, there's no overt reference to foliate heads or masks in the literature of the Middle Ages, and they do not appear in the bestiary alongside other hybrid figures of myth, like the centaur. Nevertheless, the abundance of surviving literature on medieval associations of flora can facilitate an interpretation of the ways that vegetative imagery was understood by their viewers. Allegories of fruiting foliage are often found among the texts studied in the cathedral schools, such as this text on the screen here from the Allegoriae in Universum Sacrum Scripturum, which was attributed to the Benedictine monk Rabanus Maurus. And it sheds light on medieval understandings of foliage in sculpture and its various interpretations. Written during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, it was well circulated and maintained, with monastic communities and retaining the books and producing new copies for hundreds of years afterwards. It was during the reign of Charlemagne, who died around 814, that attitudes towards antiquity and the idea of ancient Rome had changed in Francia, restored to the ideal model of law and order, and a well-structured, civilized city at the very heart of the empire. As a strong patron of education and the arts, Charlemagne facilitated new building programs and encouraged the output of manuscript production and the learning of his sons and courtiers at the royal school. Scholars were hired to teach from around Europe, including Britain, Ireland, and Lombardy, among them Alcuin of York. At this time, York had a cathedral school that was well equipped with books. Indeed, these Carolingian scholars, including Alcuin, were well versed in the literary works of the classical world, including Virgil and Ovid, and their Christianized allegorical interpretations. As such, many classical texts have survived today due to the efforts and output from the Carolingian scribes, and were able to be continually read, copied, and disseminated long into the golden age of monasticism in the 11th and 12th centuries. So networks of intellectual exchange in France were well developed by the Carolingian Renaissance, and a monastic library reflects the tastes and the interests of those people who were responsible for it. Indeed, Laurel Cathedral had 3 copies of Rabanus's writings for the purpose of teaching, and it had acquired an array of manuscripts in the 9th century from various scriptoria, including Soissons, Cambrai, Paris, and around the Ile-de-France. So this Allegoriae makes reference to the broader associations of vegetative metaphor found in the Bible, with particular reference to passages from the Old Testament books of Genesis, Ezekiel, and Job. A well-circulated encyclopedic text, written during the late 8th and 9th centuries, as I've said, it would have been referenced by students and influenced the thinking of later medieval doctrinal teachings and writings. So with this in mind, it proves to be a very valuable tool in attempting to recapture these medieval understandings of foliage in and on sacred buildings. So among Rabanus's explications is this section entitled Ramus, which means branches. So I'll read my English translation as you can follow in the Latin. So Rabanus writes, and that's on the screen, "The branch is good affection, as we read in Genesis, bringing an olive branch with flowing leaves, which the Holy Spirit delivers in order to calm the mind endowed with goodness to pure thoughts. The branch of the sins of the flesh, as we read in Ezekiel. Behold how they apply the branch to their own noses, which takes pleasure in the base will of the body. Through the branches of sacred doctrine, as was said in the Gospel, as the birds of the sky come and dwell in the branches of this proud world, which God is calling to come to faith and rest in his sacred teachings. And through the branches of good works, as was said in Job. And these branches send forth new growth, that is, good works appear. And through the branches of sacred scripture, as we read in the Gospel, they used to hew branches from the trees, That is, they were learning from the sacred works of the Holy Fathers, and through the branches of crooked men, as we read in Job, fire shall dry up his branches, that depraved men shall lay waste to eternal damnation. So here, according to the Allegoriae, branches could symbolize the pleasures or sins of the flesh, an idea that does not seem out of place when considering the earlier Romanesque incarnations of foliate heads that are sometimes appear as visages of torment. However, in the very same passage, Rabanus also explains that foliage was connected with a multitude of other notions, including moral thoughts, the fruits of good works, and the sacred in creation, evocations of which can readily be seen in Gothic vegetative sculpture. Indeed, the sculptures examined here exemplify this latter notion. So, figural bosses analogous to the Collège de Cluny keystone were carved away as far as what is now modern-day Greece. And this is the last one. So this survival was excavated from the site of the Frankish Cistercian monastery of Zarakas, Stymphalia, in the Greek Peloponnese. Built during the early 13th century, it predates the Collège de Cluny keystone by about 40 years. Following the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when a large population of the Peloponnese was under Frankish control, the church at Zarakas was commissioned by Geoffroy de Villadon, Prince of the Morea, and was built in 1225 as a four-bay basilica, with an arcaded porch at the west with a cross vault, where this keystone would have likely occupied. The Franks' time in Greece was, however, sadly quite short-lived, and by 1276 the Cistercians had all but left, maintaining only a single monastery at Daphne in Athens. However, evidence from the height of their presence in the first quarter of the 13th century gives insight into just how far Gothic foliate mask iconography had spread and developed across the Frankish Empire. The site of Zarakas and its keystone is not just a, albeit remarkable, example of the French style in Eastern Europe, but sculptural evidence for the significant spiritual, intellectual, architectural, and artistic exchange networks, which demonstrated how expansive the dissemination of ideas and Gothic iconography had developed in the 13th century. So, as previously discussed, these Gothic images were born from the cultural developments of the Carolingian and 12th century Renaissances in France, respectively. The rediscovery of the antique and classical revivalism as an artistic movement was not a new phenomenon and had knock-on effects for centuries to come. We've seen the rediscovery of not only antique sculpture, but also literary works, and these works were to become so popular and influential on the curriculum of the cathedral schools that they began to take on a new allegorized significance for a new Christian context. It's also worth remembering that nature was omnipresent in the day-to-day lives of medieval communities, no matter your social class, location, or profession. The labours of the month, agricultural tasks, with seasons for sowing and seasons for planting, much more densely forested land as well, beyond the agricultural borders of the parish, and the idea of the wild being something to be constantly aware of and fearfully respected. Clothes were made exclusively from organic matter, while building materials, medicines, and firewood for the heating of homes, and food preparation depended heavily on the cooperation of the natural world, to a much greater extent than we appreciate today. It was impractical also to travel far after nightfall or during inclement weather, carrying a real risk to yourself and your life if you did so. Nature was such a prevalent part of medieval life that it makes itself ubiquitous in all art forms, including the written word, sermons, vernacular poetry, where nature is often personified as a character all of its own. So today, in this very whistle-stop tour that is abruptly coming to an end, we began with the fountain basin at the Basilica of Santanier, dating from about 1200. I shared my research on a keystone from the Collège de Cluny, and finally, very briefly, we've just seen a keystone boss from the Frankish monastery at Zarakas in the Greek Peloponnese, which demonstrates just how extensively these images permeated the ecclesiastical environment of 13th century Europe. So, just to conclude, foliate heads and masks reflect the spaces in which we find them, at the heart of the monastic and scholarly environment, in both their social and liminal zones. The research here offers itself as a step towards developing an understanding of the cultural and symbolic importance of these images, their role in the intellectual history of the 13th and 14th centuries, and demonstrates how they might have had a didactic and not merely decorative function. It considers their relationship to antiquity, nature, life, and death, and recognises the conscious effort on the behalf of the artisan to capture, with permanency, their form. Sculptures were certainly not conceived as ephemeral objects, but endeavours worthy of eternity. It argues that these Gothic foliate heads and masks were not entirely folkloristic, either in derivision or connotation, but rather scholastic, gateways into the world and mind of medieval humanism. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Cassie. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure, I can see a few hand claps happening there. I'm sure, I speak for everybody that my knowledge of foliate faces, has really increased on listening to you. And I love this sort of, much more wider global context. So we have had a few questions, and if anybody has a question to ask, then please, raise your hand. Using the little icon, but I'm going to go straight to read a few of the questions that have come up in the chat. And the first one was from Peter Zentler Munro, who asked the question, was it possible, I don't know if Peter's still with us, is it possible that foliate heads are an imitation of the heads of Roman emperors garlanded with wreaths of laurel?
Oh, that's a very good question. And sorry, I missed the beginning of it because Teams just threw me out after I tried to stop sharing my screen. So I've missed the first part of the question. Sorry, can you ask it again, please?
Yes. Is it possible that foliate heads are in imitation of the heads of the Roman emperors garlanded with wreaths of laurel?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question indeed. I wouldn't say so. I don't recall, in fact, any laurel in any metamorphosing forms anyway. So foliate masks and heads are objects, or they're in transition, they're allegories, they're not figures of people. They embody human nature as nature personified, which is why everybody loves them so much, and you can see elements of yourself in them. And you do get figures of, on tympana, of processions, of human figures holding garlands and having laurel leaves and flags and processions, but they don't change, they don't metamorphose in the same way, I don't think anyway. But it's a very good question.
Okay, we'll take another question from the chat then. This one was from Andrew Jenkins, who basically asked that he'd noticed the foliate carving at Cluny used limestone, and at Southwell Mansfield limestone was used. So he's thinking, did the nature of the material perhaps influence the designs of the masons?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, anybody who might be a stonemason here today will know that you have to carve with the shape that you're given in the block of stone. And the same is true for misericords and with wood as well, which I didn't get a chance to talk about today. But you can definitely see where people are trying to incorporate, the knotwork of the trees themselves into the wood carvings. And it's much the same with the stones. And with the Collège de Cluny keystone, you may have noticed it had a ring in its mouth, which is a later addition, perhaps to host a rope for the holding up of the light. So yeah, I definitely would say so, yeah.
Aoife, are there any questions? Anyone raising their hands?
There's just somebody, is it Kay Old, who's got his hand up? Kay, would you like to unmute if you've got a question?
Mistake. Sorry.
All right, no worries. Okay, so then we have our next hand up is Sue Jacob. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering about the expressions on some of the faces, because a lot of the, just flicking through the book that I have on the Green Man, some of them are really horrific, with really grotesque expressions and with tongues lolling out. Do you have any thoughts on the variance in facial expressions that you get on the things, can't you?
Absolutely, definitely. And Basford's brick is wonderful, by the way. I love it. And all the colour, well, the plates at the end, fantastic study. But yes, when you look at Gothic masks specifically, they get progressively unhappier over time as you get closer to the Black Death and the Plague, which you see these images really starting to reflect what's happening in society at the time. And this is why I find the dichotomy between masks and heads quite fascinating, because the masks are more popular in Europe than they are in Britain, and the heads more popular in Britain than Europe, and vice versa. And there seems to be a change in iconography between the two. I mean, are they two sides to the same coin? Are they antithetical? You know, like the trope of the wise and foolish virgins on the sides of cathedrals, some happy and some sad, some, you know, sin are some salvation. So you're absolutely right. They seem to carry different meanings, and it's all very site specific. So depending on the cathedral, the monastery, or the church that you're looking at, they tend to integrate with the space in different ways. And you're absolutely right to mention that, because yes, some of them are really quite visceral, quite horrible in certain ways, and it's human suffering. And then perhaps you'll turn the corner and then lo and behold, there's a happy one. So they're all different forms of expression. Yes, absolutely. That's a really great point, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Sorry, just go for a quick twofer. You also mentioned that you get cats, which I thought was brilliant.
Yes.
You mentioned other creatures. What sort of other creatures do you come across?
Sure. So cats are extremely popular. You have occasionally dogs. Here in Kent, we have a pig on the parish church of Wye. It's a bit later, so 14th, 15th century, but there is a pig on the north side if ever you're in the area visiting. And yeah, you have some which don't appear to be a particular animal at all, but they're more bestial, and they carry an amalgam of elements from various different creatures. But cats are definitely the most popular choice in the Norman Romanesque art, which I find fab, personally.
Thank you.
Any more hands up, Aoife, or shall I go back to ask a question from the chat?
Well, do you want to ask a question from the chat, and then we can go back to the hands afterwards?
Okay, so Ian Hayward, he thinks that there seems to be a lot of the foliate heads in transitional spaces such as doorways and cloisters, and he asks you, Cassie, do you think there is a guardian element to them and their positioning?
Yes, absolutely. So earlier heads, Romanesque ones, definitely seem to carry a more apotropaic function, and Rita Wood has written a wonderful article on this. It's free online if you want to look at it. It's called Before the Green Man, and so this is the period before my period, which is Gothic, so 1200 and later. But in the Gothic period, then yes, absolutely, you know, they're on these kind of liminal zones, like portals, so doorways, vestibules, lintels, capitals, places of transition. And, you know, they mark the boundaries between secular and holy zones. They mark, you know, entrances, silent and spoken zones as well. And not just in the physical sense as well, but in a way that may even allude to, and this is my thoughts, you know, living in the dead as well, that idea of life and time works differently as well in certain sculptures, particularly the ones in France that you see around Paris.
Fantastic. Is there a question, Aoife, from somebody else? Or?
Does Paul Heath want to unmute and ask his question?
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much. You mentioned early on that they were the green men, or the foliate heads, as we now call them, were commonly found on structural elements of buildings. Do you think there was a significance to that? I was thinking that maybe, you know, trees were great structures, weren't they, which supported things. So do you think there's anything in that, or that they were on those structural elements to represent, to help hold up the building in some way?
Yeah, definitely. And I really love that you've just brought up trees as well as structural elements, because, you know, with the height and light of Gothic, the piers, it was often referred to as, you know, the nave of a church might look like a forest. And so, yes, when you have these objects on, you know, capitals that are necessary to support the lintel, or a ceiling boss without which the bosses would collapse, or, you know, tympanums I mean, they're not strictly structural, but without which there'd be a massive hole in the west facade of the cathedral. So, yes, I think that they're an integral part of the fabric of the church, and the structural element definitely has a real significance. I do think, definitely. I'm just trying to think now of some examples in particular, but it's left me. But yeah, I would definitely say so. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, another question from the chat from Jason Smith, if you're with us still, Jason. Jason's basically thinking about the changes that happen with the Gothic, so that make the foliate heads that you focus on, Cassie, different from the earlier examples. Is there anything that you can tell us about that?
What, so specifically the changes that you see in the iconography or in where they appear? Sorry, what was the question?
I think in terms of their iconography. Yeah.
So definitely they become softer, more human, and they take on this more quasi-human significance than you see previously, where you have these almost distorted large eyes, large ears, large teeth, this very almost aggravated image. It suddenly becomes sophisticated in a way that it seems to reflect the changing intellectual ideas and the stylistic changes of the time. And this continues for a period of about 150 years. And then after 1350, as I say, there's a kind of lapse, and they go back to having these bulging eyes and almost grotesque-like features. And that changes then over the course of the next 300 years until we get to the Gothic revival in the 19th century.
Well, it'd be interesting when you finally get access to come and visit our chapter house in Southwell, what you make of the green men that you encounter then, or the foliate head.
They're all beautiful, Helen.
And any other questions from the floor, Aoife?
Yeah, so we've got Kath McNeil has her hand up. Does she want to unmute and ask her question?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. It was an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I've been interested in green men for over 30 years now. Myself and my husband, we've been all over England and Europe collecting photographs of green men. And I've just written an essay at the University of York about wild men and their iconography. And I've got two questions really. And it's just basically how far and how close do you think the iconography of the green man and the wild man and the woodwoes is? And again, they're also portrayed in woman form, but it's not so common.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And the second thing, I'm going after that lady for the 2 for 1, is in the literature, I've read that green men are never to be found on a font. And in my travels, I have discovered at least 2 on a font.
Yes.
So just wondered what you think about those.
Yes. So people have often said that lovely myth of they're never on fonts, monumental sculpture, nope, it's all architectonic, and they mostly are. But yes, I've encountered at least 3 different fonts and the fountain that I shared today. So yes, this whole idea of purification and water and what fonts were used for by either the secular communities who might come for baptism or monastic communities to cleanse and reflect on and to think about the issues of the world. They were really powerful rhetorical devices to meditate on in that sense. But yeah, with the wild men, that's a good one, because I love the way they appear in manuscripts, these hairy almost woodwoses, and they're often carrying off women and doing very nasty things, but they're so much fun. But they don't metamorphose, and so that's where I know lots of people have aligned wild men and foliate masks and heads, and in the same way they have with Sheila and their gigs. But I think they all do very, very different things, but they're all part of the same kind of corpus of ideas and the same kinds of people. So in that sense, I'd say they relate, but not in the iconography or what they're trying to do in space.
Thank you very much. And I also noticed when you said that the faces get gentler over time, that's exactly the same with the wild men. And I've read several articles that link it with the so-called discovery of the New World. And once sort of native Amerindians came into view and linked with with Western Europe, that's when the iconography of these wild men changes, because if you like, it's got the new wild man. I know that's not woke to be talking about this now, but 16th century. And I just wondered if it's a pure coincidence or there might be something in that.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I know nothing about it. So I'd be really interested in reading your essay if ever you wanted to email it to me, and we could have a chat about it. That sounds
Oh, you
fun.
can have it with pleasure. I didn't get a particularly
Thank you
brilliant
very
mark, but I enjoyed writing it.
That's all that matters.
Thank you, Kath. And Kath, you'll be joining us to do your dissertation research on the chapter house, won't you? So we'll really be looking forward to hearing more about that in due course. And James Wright has just popped up on a message saying that he's going to be doing a talk on in April, and he's going to be covering wild men in that talk. So we'll hear more about wild men there.
I'll be there with my pen. Yep.
So I've got another question from the chat. I think we've probably got time for this one and maybe a couple more. And it's from Hilary Moxon. I don't know if Hilary's there. And they say, have you come across links with the Virgin in your examination? Foliate heads can be seen in profusion in spaces associated with her. And Hilary is thinking particularly of Exeter's Lady Chapel and York's Chapter House, which contains 34 such heads. So I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Cassandra.
Absolutely. So yes, you're absolutely right. Ely's Lady Chapel is filled with these objects, but they've been heavily painted over, which makes it quite difficult to kind of see the expressions beneath the paint. And yes, I've seen them also on corbels supporting Virgin and the Child sculpture as well. So again, there's this supporting kind of architectonic, real structural function that they have, the practical function as well as the allegorical. And these you can find, in ambulatories or, the radiating chapels from churches. And sometimes they appear in the East End as well, but it's less likely. But yeah, definitely. No, that's a good point.
OK, so shall we go back to another question from the floor, Aoife?
Yeah, if we make this the last question from the floor, if John Anderson wants to say his question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. What you mentioned the didactic function, perhaps, of a green man, so-called. What didactic function could they have?
That's a very site-specific thing, really, I must say, because that's the beauty of these objects, is that they don't carry one meaning. They are so multifaceted and in their spectrum, in their reach, in their iconography, in their geographic region, in the sculptural objects in which they were carved for, and the way they inhabit the space as well, and who's commissioning them and designing them and how they want that to relate to the wider iconographical program. And I think the main issue that a lot of published material on these objects, at least that I found with it, is that there's this, and it's very interesting in its own right, but to kind of trace the origins of the motif and to kind of create a chronology, which is wonderful, but taking them, in this case, outside of their historical context without looking at the site-specificity of these images causes you to lose this didactic meaning. And so what I would suggest anybody who's a fan of these objects, rather than taking them at face value on their own, but start to look at the wider iconographical programs in which they're situated, and then you'll be able to find what that space is saying. So when with regards to Southwell, for example, you've got 36 stalls with tympana, and only 6 are carved with foliate heads. They're a very small portion of the wider iconographical program, so they're only a small portion of what that space is trying to say. Does that answer your question, John? Sorry if not. I'll have to think a bit more about it if I'm going to answer across the board. Partly.
Thank you, Cassie. Well, I think we better wrap it up there. I know there's still quite a few outstanding questions. So I'm sure, and also in the chat today, there were 1 or 2 people who made comments about your talk, which you might like to have a look at those as well. So I'm sure, we can perhaps encourage people to email if there's anything that they wanted to add, because that might be more things for you to consider for your PhD, which I know you're completing at the moment. And I really wanted to thank you so much for spending time with us today, because I know you must be under a lot of stress at the moment trying to finish things off. So we really do appreciate it, and it's been so interesting. So thank you for that. I really wanted to thank everyone today for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I just wanted to add that there is no charge for these talks, as you know, but we are inviting donations. And the last year has been, as you can imagine, particularly challenging for us. And we've experienced a significant drop in income. So all donations will be really, really appreciated to help our work at the Minster, particularly with the chapter house. A link to donate is in the confirmation email, or you can get in touch with Aoife and she will give you more information. And we really do thank you for all your support. Also, straight after we've finished the talk, Aoife is going to be emailing an evaluation form to you. And I have to tell you, we do read each one of these forms really carefully because it really does help us inform future sessions. So please, if you can, take time to fill it in, and it shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. I also wanted to mention our next online talk, to give a plug for that, because it's a really special one. It's on the 23rd of March, and we're going to be joined by two of our lovely stewards at the Minster, Janet Stocks and Joanne Johnson. And their talk will examine what life might have been like in medieval England at the turn of the 13th century when the chapter house was built. So we're really going to be looking at the context of the time, the historical context. So that's going to be really fascinating. And they're going to be suggesting some of the possible reasons as to why certain leaves and other carvings were selected to be immortalised in stone. So that's really going to increase our knowledge of the chapter house. And information and booking will be available on our website. I think it's on there now. So once again, Cassie, thank you for such an interesting talk, and thank you to the National Heritage Lottery Fund for providing the funds for us to do the essential conservation work on our wonderful building. And we do hope to see you again, joining us on the 23rd of March. Thank you, everybody.